Welcome everyone. Meghan with AASHE here. Going to be giving some folks a few moments here to join, but thanks for chiming in here today for our second discussion series session on racial equity and social justice. So we're just going to give folks a few moments here to log on. So get comfortable, hopefully have some water near you, maybe do some stretches while we give folks a moment. And I'm really excited to be introducing our speakers today shortly. We have quite a few folks that are joining us, and feel free. It's great to see everybody on video. It gives us the impression that we're sort of like in a conference room or meeting room somewhere together. It's great to see everyone. And the first that joined are going to hear me probably repeating myself a little bit. Apologies. I guess a couple logistical things as we're waiting for a few other folks to join. Again, I'm Meghan with AASHE, thrilled to see all of you here. First of all, everybody's going to be muted for most of the time. We're going to do questions at the end. Should you have a question throughout the session, feel free to throw it in the chat, and we will do our best to get to questions, as many questions as possible, about 15 or 10 minutes before the top of the hour. And inevitably, I am in downtown Philadelphia, and there is inevitably going to be a siren that goes by. So you'll hear my co-host, Rusty, who is my dog. Hopefully he doesn't necessarily take too much of our time, but he always howls when there's a siren. All right, cool. I think we have a bulk of the attendees here. Perhaps others will begin joining. So officially starting, again, welcome everyone to the second discussion series for AASHE's Racial Equity and Social Justice series. Really thrilled to have you all here, and appreciate my colleagues at Team AASHE, Kimberly Smith, who is here, who's going to be monitoring Q&A, as well as Nakia Johnson, who is both of whom have helped organize this series and will be supporting us throughout today's call. And really the intention of this discussion series as a whole is to really advance the conversations within the sustainability and higher education community on racial equity and social justice. For those of you that participated last week, you heard me share a little bit about our history. Since our inception, AASHE has used a very broad definition and deep definition of sustainability. We have always seen social justice as part of our work, but throughout the past several years, really we've seen a number of different things happen. Number one, there's still this misinterpretation when we say the word sustainability of people like, oh, that's the wastewater and energy folks, when the reality of the work that we do is much deeper, much broader. So several years ago now, it became very clear to us on staff that what more could and should we be doing to help our community understand the breadth and depth of sustainability. And a lot of that really started internally. Several years ago, you'll be hearing from Debbie in a few minutes, who's been on our advisory council for the DEI committee. We developed a DEI statement, felt so thrilled with that work, but pretty quickly also recognized that diversity, equity, and inclusion, while awesome, was really just starting our journey. So really in the past year and a half, almost 2 years, AASHE's been on doing some in-depth work to center racial equity and social justice in everything that we do, because we cannot have sustainable campuses without addressing racial equity and social justice. That's what brings us to today's call, to this discussion series. And I'm so thrilled to introduce you to our speakers today, each of which has connections to AASHE in one way or another. First of all, we have Kimberly Lewis, Senior VP at U.S. Green Building Council. Also, I'll say Kimberly has been my big sister for almost 20 years because we used to work together at the U.S. Green Building Council. So this is a little bit of a AASHE family, USGBC family for me reunion, which is awesome. So Kimberly, thank you for being here. We also have Debbie Namugayi, who's the senior consultant at RETEC outside of Washington, D.C. Debbie's had a lot of experience in higher education and now is in the private sector. And we also have Eriqah Vincent, who's held a couple of different positions now for several months, both at the Partnership for Southern Equity and now more recently at PowerShift Network as the Network Engagement Director. And Eriqah has also had a lot of work in the past around National Wildlife Federation, really supporting students and young professionals in the sustainability movement. So first of all, I want to say thanks and welcome to our panelists today, Kimberly, Debbie, and Eriqah. And I thought as a way of helping the participants here understand a little bit more about each of you, maybe we'd start with a question of each of you has had an in-depth experience at this point on sustainability. What brought you to this work? And Eriqah, let's start with you.
Sure, happy to. Hope everybody can hear me. It's good to see so many people on the webinar today. Thank you, Meghan and AASHE, for this invite. I'm really excited to be here with you. So what I think the question was, what started me in sustainability? So as Meghan mentioned, I am transitioning out of one job and into another. So I'm transitioning out of my position as Just Energy Manager at the Partnership for Southern Equity, which is a racial equity organization that is geared towards increasing equitable practices and policies in the American South, and into a network engagement director, the network engagement director position at the PowerShift Network, which is an organization that is focused on youth engagement and a network of organizations that are focused on youth engagement and youth-centered and led climate policy and climate issues. So what got me involved in the sustainability field, I guess, is I started while I was in college. I am a 2010 graduate of Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have a bachelor's degree, in comparative women's studies from Spelman. And while I was doing that work, my concentration was activism in my major. However, while I was doing that work, I was also extracurricularly focused on EJ and environmental justice work and sustainability. And around the time where I got started in 2008, sustainability was kind of a buzzword, but people really didn't know what it meant. So we spent a lot of our time in my student organization focused on educating communities of color, and communities who wouldn't necessarily hear the word sustainability. Back in 2008, it still was kind of something that folks heard about, but didn't really know fully what it meant, especially deep in communities of color and lower income communities. And so we spent a lot of our time educating communities on that in my student organization, which is actually chartered at Morehouse's campus, which is the all-male HBCU across the street, around the corner, around a parking deck, really right next to us. And so we spent a lot of our time, as I said, educating communities and also getting educated ourselves on not only how folks, people of color, folks that are systemically disenfranchised, how they fit in this EJ and sustainability work. And we found that they fit more so than anyone really wanted to admit or acknowledge into that work, when a lot of times, more often than not, communities of color and communities that are plagued with disenfranchisement and disinvestment are at the helm, are at the center of environmental injustices. And so we started educating ourselves on where our space was in that place. And from there, I kind of found my niche and found what I was really passionate about. And that was about community, but about community in places and spaces where they really didn't have a voice. And they weren't at the tables for some of these, I should say, unorthodox, not unorthodox, but harmful practices that were plaguing these communities. And so we wanted to give them a voice. We wanted to give them the education and the tools that they needed. And so that has always been kind of my North Star, is giving communities the voice and the education that they need to speak up for themselves and to advocate for themselves, and to be in those rooms where those decisions are being made that are ultimately affecting the health and wellness of families and children in those communities and spaces.
You've done amazing work, Eriqah, and obviously will continue to do so at PowerShift Network. And I really appreciate you really emphasizing, or to me, it's so clear, the value of student engagement, because it sounds like so much of your experience and all the contributions you've made really stem back to your experience as an undergrad. And I share that because a lot of my work really started as an undergrad as well. I like to say pain in the butt student activist. Perhaps that resonates with you as well. So thanks for sharing that background. Debbie, can you share your thoughts, how you got started in this work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you everyone for joining today. I don't think I've interfaced with this many people in 4 months, maybe. So my start in sustainability starts in undergrad as well. I kind of declared my environmental science major by accident. I thought I'd study business, and I think a lot of that comes from my immigrant background and knowing that a traditional path is what's most secure. But I was lucky in that I had a mother who worked for an international organization and saw people with all kinds of degrees in the US, and she knew that there was a future career out there for me. So that gave me some good guidance. But going into the field and deciding to pursue it with a sustainability lens, it was really about, I'm doing this work, but I don't feel that I'm being given information about how I can create change, right? So you're studying all these environmental science concepts, and I want to know, well, how can I impact change? How can I be productive? And so I ended up getting a master's in sustainability at Arizona State. And that was really focused on like, okay, let's think about systems, let's think about solutions. I think one of the things that I know we'll probably just touch on in this conversation is the continual journey of being a minority and being an immigrant in this field, and how to get more people that look different than what comes to people's mind when they think of someone in the environmental field, how to get a more diverse range of people, how, you know, what kind of outreach is involved in that. And so that's really been a passion for me, because I feel like I had this one piece of luck in having a mother that recognized that there were alternate career paths to kind of the trope that people with an immigrant story come in with, of being a doctor or a lawyer or something very secure. So going into my actual career, knowing that I wanted to be really solutions oriented, that's what drew me to higher education and working in that space. So I've been lucky to work in 3 very different institutions. I've worked at a major R1 research institution. I've worked at a elite private school, and I've worked at a more regional state institution, all building sustainability programs at that level. And, you know, navigating sustainability is still a newer concept when you're thinking of the more traditional setting that is higher education, and figuring out how to create change in those spaces, how to work with people who are used to the status quo, and then also how, and, you know, sometimes not exactly succeeding on how to, you know, have my voice get heard, whether that's because of the fact that I'm working in a newer field, or because people might not see me as a person of authority. But it's always been a learning experience, and I'm really grateful to AASHE for the support that the organization has given me over the years. I currently work for Retech Advisors. It is a consulting firm, so I've moved into the private sector. And in this space, I work on ESG, which I think some people might not be super familiar with. So you've heard of, it went from environmental science, right, to sustainability, to ESG, and what is that? So that stands for environmental social governance. And that work is really focused, I think, honestly, it's really helped me make sure that the social piece is framed in the work that we do. And I think in the last 4 months, we've seen a lot more trends in between the COVID crisis and between issues around racial equity, given the murder of George Floyd, seeing that be even more at the forefront for our clients, which is really exciting, because our clients are mostly real estate investment companies, and to see a group that might not always have diverse leadership at the top say that this matters to us and we want to lend our voice and be impactful. So that's where my career is now, and it's been really exciting.
Awesome, Debbie. Thanks for sharing all that, and a few reflections based on what I heard. I appreciate you really uplifting not only sort of your experience around not necessarily feeling there being a space for diverse voices in higher education and some of your experience, but also what I heard was that your need for solutions-based thinking and really seeing the Masters in Sustainability at ASU as a way to sort of bring together solutions and perhaps even a place where more diverse voices were represented. I'd be curious to hear more about that perhaps later in our discussion, whether or not that was your experience or not. But I'm also so thrilled for you in your role in the private sector, and I'm excited to see what comes next for you.
Thank you.
Kimberly, of course, I know some of your background here. If you can share with our participants today, what brought you to this work?
Thank you, Megan. Thank you to AASHE leadership, all of your volunteers, your members as well, and to my fellow panelists. Shout out to Partnership for Southern Equity. I was going to highlight you all. So glad to be on here with you, and congratulations to your next. And to all of my fellow panelists, I'm very excited for this moment. But if you ask me what brought me here, I came kicking and screaming. I am not a greenie. My younger brother is bitter to today as a science educator on how I got this job. I was failing environmental science in college, and literally I had my younger brother guiding me through the process. And so I love to share that with folks. For me, so I call this a calling of purpose as to why I am at the Green Building Council and have been able to grow and flourish in this journey that is always evolving. For me, I am a marketing and communications background and very focused in that, and worked on the Hill with an express Democratic leader, governor, and worked for a civil rights leader, Marian Wright Edelman, in planning her memoirs book tour, and got the calling to do global corporate events back when it was just amazing to be in Ibiza and to be in Hawaii and to be in all the places that I wasn't able to afford growing up, and experiencing and building fabulosity. So the idea of sustainability and less is more, all the things that Meghan held me authentically accountable for when I came in the doors was just not my thinking and my vision for my career. But what I do know is women, a lot of times we compartmentalize our lives. And I am a third generation of ministers, preachers, pastors on my father's side, and educators. My mom was a principal in Baltimore City Public Schools. And for me, it was unbelievable when I came in, having spent my 90s planning amazing events, but then when there was so much misreporting and a lack of integrity and key corporate I would say infrastructures at that time, I really felt like I was at an intersection of how I was living out my values in that moment. While I'm moving out and flying out and planning millions and billions of events, while the company was going bankrupt, while lying and misreporting and laying off people while we were still spending dollars, and literally coming back to the office with the sheriffs in the lobby because they were concerned about laid off employees coming back to blow up the place. And I said to my boss, I really don't get it. I don't understand what's, and her point is, oh yeah, layoffs, this is corporate America. Just keep doing what you're doing. We'll move on. And I was struggling with how I was living out those foundational values that I experienced of faith and putting people at the center of the work. And just so happened that the same headhunter that brought me to that corporate world told me about the Green Building Council, and a neighbor, she's like, you need to go over there and see what they're doing. And I said, nonprofit, wait a minute, no more quarterly bonuses. She said, I know who you are, go over there. And I went there, and by the end of an entire day, I interviewed with everyone. I knew this was the moment. So for those folks that are wondering, when you put out the vision of where you want to be authentically, holistically, then I do believe those opportunities come. And one of the first places that I went was a green school in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And the trees were growing out of the center of the school, and the kids were farming their own lunch, and it was just so interactive. And I thought about my mother's school in Baltimore City, where they have bars on the windows, and their idea of getting a school healthy and ready and resilient for our children every day was making sure that things worked, that doors closed and opened well, that the water fountains were working. And it just made me realize the inequities and why I was purposed for this season and time. And it's why I've stayed 20 years. So thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. I love hearing and remembering the days of you kicking and screaming. But here, 20 years later, USGBC and the Green Building Movement would not be what it is without Kimberly's leadership. So all of you that might be familiar with USGBC, as well as just the evolution of LEAD, so much of the expansion and deepening of their work is really a testament to Kimberly's dedication. And I guess I'm curious, so each of you have had perhaps like direct roles, present and past, in advancing racial equity and social justice in some way, shape, or form. I'd be really curious, because again, what I shared at the beginning and something that we've really struggled with for years is sort of this disconnect around, oh, there's sustainability, and then there's racial equity and social justice over here. Whereas what we are trying to emphasize is the fundamental interconnectedness. Again, that you cannot have a sustainable campus without addressing racial equity and social justice. And I'd be curious to hear from each of you the challenges and the successes that you each have had in advancing that racial equity and social justice agenda amidst the sustainability conversations. Eriqah, can we start with you?
Sure. If you didn't call on me, I was going to jump in. Yeah, this is great. This is a great question. So prior to my work at Partnership for Southern Equity, I met Meghan when I worked at the National Wildlife Federation for almost 6 years, which for my, lots of folks who are my age, lots of friends of mine were like, you're still there. I was working at National Wildlife Federation in our higher education space, the program, I should say. Lots of people who still work there. And I oftentimes, unfortunately, oftentimes the only Black woman in the room, really, I mean, if we want to be real, had to bring up, are we centering voices of color in this space? Are we centering Black voices in this space? Which I always like to be clear that, when we're talking about people of color, when we're talking about Black people, we need to be clear about the differences in those experiences, because oftentimes, not always, but this can be a touchy subject. So folks might shift in their seats a bit, but not always. When we're talking about people who have been systemically disenfranchised, when we're talking about people who live in a country that the foundation of that country, and many documents at the foundation of that country have words written into them that are geared towards disenfranchising them. When we're talking about the Constitution and we're talking about the Declaration of Independence and we're talking about those words, and the words that are so, at the same time, so inspirational and valuable and make us feel patriotic, but at the same time, in the same document, making other people and reminding other people that they are less than. And then we're talking about people of color on the flip side, which can include Black people, but doesn't always. Oftentimes includes people who are who came here in one way or another voluntarily. So I like to make that distinction when I'm having these conversations. And so flipping over to my time at NWF, I oftentimes was in the space of saying, you know, how are we centering voices of color, one, Black voices, two, or same, you know, not in any particular order, but how are we centering those voices and how are we centering those experiences, which can be very different. You know, folks often say, you know, especially Black folks often say, you know, Black folks have been practicing sustainability for centuries. Y'all just called it something pretty, you know, but we've been doing this for a long time. You know, my grandmother's been reusing things and recycling things for a very long time. And so, you know, but we wanted to call, she's not calling it that, you know, my grandmother's 96. So if you say recycling to her, she doesn't know what that means, but she does know that she keeps a bin of plastic bags to use for whatever reason in her home because you don't throw things away. And so I think that, you know, in doing that, how are we centering those voices of people who have always done this, and making sure that I am injecting that? And it's exhausting. I also want to say, before I pass it on to my other panelists, it can be very exhausting to be the only voice of color and or Black voice in the room, to have to interject that. And not necessarily, you know, I'm blessed to not have been in spaces where folks have disagreed with me or fervently disagreed with me. And I get a lot of head nods of like, yes, that's important, let's do that. But how are we making sure that even when Black folks aren't in the room, even when voices of color aren't in the room, folks are still standing up for those people? And folks are still saying, you know, we need to make sure that we're also entering a conversation around race or racism in our different systems and institutions. And I bring those other documents in our country to the forefront of this conversation, because if we're going to build very old, very white, oftentimes, institutions into the fold of being sustainable, we have to remember the country, the soil in which they were founded upon. And so it's really important when those institutions are microcosms of a larger society that we live in.
Eriqah, thank you so much for uplifting that. And just a couple of reflections on what I heard from you is not only highlighting those important documents to our country and the inherent inequity and injustice that is baked into them, but also a lot of what our work at AASHE has been doing is sort of looking in the mirror of higher education and recognizing higher education's direct connections to slavery. And the fact that our discussion last week, for those that weren't there, really started with recognizing the systemic racism that so much of higher education has been founded on and perpetuates to this day, and sort of shining that light on the realities of that, where well-intentioned white folks are sort of like, oh, but that's at arm's length. I'm not there. We are part of these systems, actively part of these systems. So Eriqah, I really appreciate you highlighting them, as well as the other really important thing I appreciate you sharing, which is I don't think you said burden, so I'm gonna use that word because I don't remember the one you used, of being the only person of color or Black person in a room at times. And because sustainability in higher education, AASHE staff and the AASHE community, sustainability in higher ed, is predominantly white. Part of our journey has been, why is that? And starting to uncover, why is that? And Nakia, who's been with this organization for 10 years, how many times, Nakia, every year at our annual conference, there would be someone who would come up to you, a person of color or Black person, saying, why are there not more people here that look like you and I? So that really, Eriqah, to your point, it was one of the pieces where AASHE was like, we have got to start asking some deep questions. So I really appreciate you uplifting a lot of that. Debbie, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, not just based on the conversation, but again, sort of your experiences in centering racial equity and social justice in your work.
Yeah, and I definitely want to touch on the higher ed lens. I think one of the big questions that we all need to ask ourselves is, what are we sustaining? If you think of the history of any institution, and I don't mean higher ed, I mean just the term institution, that this country and much of the world, because imperialism is a global thing, much of the world is built on is a lens that centers white supremacy. So what are we going to be sustaining when we talk about sustainability? And that can't just be the recycling and the energy efficiency. It all comes down to people. I think that's really where I have tried to root the work I do around diversity and inclusion. I've always struggled, and I don't know that I've said this openly, and so I'm just going to. I've always been really frustrated that sometimes even sustainability professionals, diversity work is like, let's make sure we promote the diversity office's event on a multicultural night. And it's like, so you retweeted or like, reposted something on Instagram, like what does that accomplish, right? Like that's a step, but that does not get at what it like, does not get at the root of anything. So one thing that I've always wanted to do and have worked on in some regard, and it's hard because you're trying to shift a whole system, is have a more diverse group of students that I work with. So in the higher ed space, I've had close to 40 interns, and I've had these interns at elite institutions, and when I was at a regional institution, it was a not very diverse part of Kentucky. So what am I doing to promote diversity in that space? Who am I recruiting? What events am I going to recruit students? And then their next question is going to be like, why? Why would I do this? How does this benefit me? So if we're going to have more voices that are diverse in the sustainability space, we're going to need to find ways to communicate. What does a career look like? What are internships? What are jobs? Where can you make enough money to sustain yourself? Because not everyone has the opportunity to do the unpaid nonprofit internship. I think a lot of the things that have made me an anomaly, like compared to if you looked at me on paper and all of the minority boxes that I check off versus the things I've gotten to do, it's because I learned early on to network. I learned early on to be proactive about understanding the field because I was freaked out. I was like, okay, like I got the go ahead from my immigrant family, like, sure, you can study the weird thing. You can be that anomaly, but like, I still needed to make money and have a career path. So how do I do that? And so if we're going to say, we want more diversity in this field, we want more people of color at the table, and then still expect them to like shove themselves into some pretty elite boxes like unpaid internships and, like not knowing how to network when they're in a university setting where we could be giving them those resources and be sitting them down and saying, hey, here's who you can call, here's this alumni network, here's all these resources that you have, at least while you're in this higher ed space, which is a privileged space, you're in there, so now what? I think if we're not doing that, then like we're remiss to say we're going to support improving diversity without getting at the root of how to even provide resources to students who from any background, and sustainability is a field where you don't have to be an expert in environmental science. We have people here with marketing backgrounds, with Kimberly Lewis, and people who are more data driven and into like tech, that they can all be part of the sustainability field, but they won't be at the table if you don't give them the chance to integrate their background into a future career path. So I think that was a little rambling, but
No, it wasn't.
I'm so passionate about saying not just, oh yes, increase diversity, but hey, you are a student and a person of color. Here's what that actually looks like. And here's how I did it. Here's the challenges I faced. And here's how you can surmount them for the next generation.
Debbie, I think that's so fantastic. And I think what I heard from you was you're exactly right. Not only were you intentional about seeking out diversity of people in a number of different ways when you were on higher education campuses, but also giving these students an opportunity to see what's possible. And what I just heard from you is recognizing that you don't just need to be failing environmental science like Kimberly Lewis was, or pursuing a specific sustainability master's degree like you did, Debbie, but also recognizing that there are sustainability career pathways for a number of different skill sets. And I think your point, until that light is shown, that's not obvious to so many. A couple other pieces I heard from you, Debbie, that I just think really deserve to be emphasized. And I think one of our, Joanne also appreciated this, your question, what are we trying to sustain, is so important. And again,
Absolutely.
in the spirit of this discussion series is trying to help us as individuals, agents of change, start to ask the questions of how am I contributing, perpetuating systemic racism, both in my life as well as in my job? How is my institution perpetuating systemic racism? And how do we not just stop, how do we actively contribute to anti-racism? This is part of the journey that AASHE is on. By no means are we at the end, and Debbie, I think you spoke to this earlier, there isn't a finish line, much like with a lot of the sort of operational sides of sustainability that we talk about, there's not a finish line. We just keep getting better and better. So Debbie, I appreciate you really uplifting that. The other piece that I really wanted to emphasize, what I heard you talk about, the way I interpret it is sort of meaningful partnership. So retweeting something from a multicultural center, great. But like the way I heard that, Debbie, is especially for the sustainability professionals, as well as faculty on this call, if not students as well, is really the question I would start to think about is what does meaningful engagement and support and partnership look like? So I really appreciate you uplifting that. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to that point, just to get at a little bit of an answer to that question, and then give the other panelists some time, is I think having a more in-depth conversation with those offices, with the diversity and inclusion offices on your campuses, and saying, and I'll take that beyond whatever kind of organization anyone on this call works for, if it's outside of higher ed. If that's the HR department or there's someone charged with work like that, what are the challenges that they're facing, and how can the resources that your office has, because every part of any kind of organization has different kinds of resources allocated towards it, and there might not be that synergy between those resources. So after that conversation, what does support look like once you actually really understand each other's goals, and what are the challenges faced with people doing social equity work?
Such important points. Thank you so much, Debbie. Kimberly Lewis, you've been doing this work for 20 years, trying to advancing equity, not just trying. But I remember a lot of those rooms that you were in, I remember trading architects for academics 11 years ago. And a lot of those rooms that you were in and probably are still in are incredibly white. So very curious to hear your thoughts, ideas, concerns around, and your experience in advancing racial equity and social justice within USGBC and beyond. And you're muted. Not there.
Yes, hi. Thank you. I just think the ladies have answered so strongly, and I will just high five them. You're right. It's been the landscape of that many years, and I would call on. I'm putting on my ministerial hat because we're talking about systems and structures, and what is healing? What is reparative? And I think about fragmentation. That's what I've seen. I mean, if we look at what the pandemic has offered us is the health crisis, which led to an economic jobs crisis, which stirred up and continued the already racial unrest. And then the climate folks, which we are all a part of, are saying, but what about the climate? And so that to me has, if we don't interconnect and work together, it really creates fragmentation. And it makes all of these small kings and queens of small kingdoms instead of working together. There are trade-offs along the way, but I don't want to hear someone screaming, but yes, it's still about climate, when really in this time, we're at a crisis. And putting people and their voices back at the center of all of these spaces. So that is what I have seen in the building industry, is fragmentation. And so when we think about the way forward, I want to think about what she just said about what are we continuing to build upon. And having been a part of one of the organizations that's considered big environment, some of our foundations aren't real and authentic to these issues. And we need to take a step back and understand that. I think about my organization that is lovingly focused on market transformation, but it's leadership, the top 20% of the marketplace. So inherently our mission is focused for a subset, the building infrastructure and the people that intersect there. And so having that recognition for our CEO to say, wait a minute, it's got to be all in, that attacks the very foundations of the programs, the process of what we do every single day. And so I think deep-rootedly, we do need to take a step back and address fragmentation and think about the foundations of our systems and structures, because they are reflective of the people that are at the table and who's present at the table. It's been me, and it's been very few. And being a movement builder, a person that came to launch Greenbuild, and at its height before we sold it, 30,000 people, 3-4 football fields of the clean energy economy. I mean, that was great, but there was never a subsection of growth around addressing the empowerment of it all, the diversity of it all, and creating and putting the tools in the hands of folks so that they can build their own growth and create their own community resilience. And so there's a shift that has to happen and take us all the way back. Because what I do know, and what you've seen, Meghan, is it started off with sustainability. Then the buzzword was resilience, and the same programs were wrapped to address resilience. Then we moved to health and wellness. The same programs shifted to address health and wellness. Now it's equity. The same folks, the same players are shifting and wrapping it in the marketing, which I know best, for the buzzword of today. We need to go back to the foundations, and it's not need. I think that is where the tension is risen. No longer are leaders that are coming forth from your institutions allowing for this fragmented journey.
Kimberly, thank you so much for highlighting that, because I think probably several folks on the call today, I would imagine that resonates with, like, let's just say the same thing, just put a different label on it right now, but not change anything else. And Kimberly, what I'm hearing from you, and really hopefully the folks participating today, is to really think about the systems and structures of which we are a part, to identify, again, the roots of systemic racism that are inevitable, as well as how we are perpetuating them. And Kimberly, that's what I'm hearing from you, sort of like, we can't just package the same programming, the same sustainability, this is what we've always done, this is what's going to work, and say, yes, we care about racial equity and social justice, and not change anything. Fundamentally, things need to change. Yeah, Kimberly.
It really is looking at the differentiation between supply chain and value chain. It looks different from whose perspective and who's at the center.
Well, I so appreciate that. Kimberly, the other piece I really wanted to emphasize that I think is so important, and not everybody knows this, but even when we were just chit-chatting before we started, you started with, how are you? Really, how are you? Because the truth is, we are living amidst, it feels like, multiple crises at once. Many of you on this call today know firsthand are directly impacted by COVID, have experienced family members, friends, colleagues that have died from it. And hearing, Kimberly, your point around, and I know from our community, a lot of our community members, directors of sustainability faculty are concerned about advancing the super important work that is sustainability in higher education. And right now, we have got to try and figure out how sustainability change agents in higher education can also address the immediate. And a few suggestions from folks previously have been like, how are sustainability change agents invested in the COVID response plans for institutions? Like, how are sustainability folks showing up to really support higher education institutions right now? Recognizing, Kimberly, is what you're saying, like, we are in crisis, and absolutely the climate crisis continues to weigh on all of us on this call. And right now, people are dying. We need to make sure that people are being put first. I really appreciate you really elevating that, particularly because so many communities of color, Native communities, are the ones suffering most as a result of COVID, and so other systemic injustices. So recognizing the weight that particularly people of color in this country are experiencing because of these multiple crises, that is, recognizing that is important. And because we have limited time today, because we all have other work to do, I want to ask, before we switch to Q&A, I want to ask Eriqah, Debbie, and Kimberly, maybe succinctly, what gives you hope? Kimberly, especially, you talked about hope a little bit. Actually, let's start with Kimberly again. Given all your background, Kimberly, what gives you hope?
I do believe it's hope. You know what? I was very saddened, as of course, ministry is at the center of my life, and we've had lots of deaths. And so I'm going to be at one tomorrow, and we spoke about that earlier. And what we know in this time is it is important to check on our own personal sustainability and personal resilience. So I was grateful to hear how hopeful and positive folks are. But what gives me hope is the fact that we've seen a lot happen in 2020, and many folks are saying, you know, let's get out of it. I think about what Congressman John Lewis stated in his letter is, let this be the century of justice. And I do feel like we have to finish the work that was started, onward and upward, as Dr. Dorothy Height said, and as my own, I would say, mentor, Diane Dillon Ridgely said, that this is the time for justice, and we have folks that are not going to let it go. And so in the past, we always think about returning back, moving back in the comfort zone, but no, we're moving forward. This time is not allowing us to move back. And I think that people recognizing that these are uncomfortable conversations and uncomfortable times, it really keeps us out of our comfort zone of wanting to slide back into positions of the old. So I am hopeful, just because we've heard from our leaders, past and present, and the ladies here who are very clearly sharing how passionate they are and how they choose jobs based upon their personal convictions and ways to really act out and live out those beliefs. And so that makes me hopeful as well. And I will say that the systems and structures that have held for a very long time, I call it the last dying, scrambling breath of trying to hold on, with each individual person holding themselves accountable, will make that shift.
Thank you, Kimberly. Eriqah, what gives you hope?
Yeah, that was great, Kimberly. Thank you so much. I absolutely heard you talk about Marian Wright Edelman, who is a Spelman sister, and I absolutely worship the ground that Diane Dillon literally walks on. So my heart is full by your comments. And then you also mentioned about choosing, jobs based on, I say this all the time. I say this to people who ask me about, what made me leave PSE. I absolutely adore PSE. And if you are not familiar with Partnership for Southern Equity, get familiar with Partnership for Southern Equity, especially if you want to do this work and want to do the work that you're doing in a very equitable way. But I say all the time, I am the work. I will continue to do the work because I am the work no matter where I am. And so I choose my positions, and my current director, Chandra Farley, who is the director of Just Energy at PSE, says, PSE is where I've chosen to do my life's work. And I take that and hear that from her and take it a step further and saying that I am the work. So this is my life's work. It will continue wherever I am. And wherever I choose to do so. And at this time, I've chosen to do so at PSN. And so to lead that directly into your question, Meghan, what gives me hope is there are some just, for lack of a better word, dope, amazing young people out here. I'll be 32 on Monday. Still another youth, but kind of in the middle somewhere. But there are folks younger than me. There are folks in high school and in college, and I'm seeing them more and more in my current position at PSN, at PowerShift Network, who are passionate, who know what they want to do, who know that the time is now for these changes, and who are diligent and willing and ready to do this work, whether they're being paid for it or not. And we're not all able, right? So I think Debbie said, not everyone's able to do an unpaid internship, and that's real. And so what gives me hope is working at this new organization. What has given me hope is working at PSE and seeing some amazing young people who will do this work because they know that the time is now and they cannot wait any longer. For justice, for equity, for climate justice, for environmental justice, there's just, as Kimberly said, the last dying breath of these systems that must go if we are all going to continue to move forward. And so to do the work that my soul must have in these spaces and places, to quote Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, God rest her soul, the work that my soul must have, doing it with these young people. Really, there's no way you cannot be hopeful while working with them. And so that is what inspires me at this time.
Thanks, Eriqah. I appreciate you sharing all that. Debbie, what inspires you, or what gives you hope, rather?
Definitely the staying power. It's been, so August, July, June. It's been almost 3 months, and this hasn't gone away. And pretty much everything else that is social phenomena in the age of the internet and social media goes away. And this hasn't. And I feel that at some really high up levels, we do live in a capitalist society. So at the level of corporations, we see that it's not going away. These entities are beholden to answering questions and making changes and reconciling with the system that they've benefited off of and have perpetuated in a lot of ways. I'm currently obsessed with Netflix's new chief marketing officer, who is a Black woman. And it's also great to see that in this stepping up, I see a lot of institutions that are stepping up and showing their diversity metrics, and the person of color is the sustainability vice president. So any example where they say, well, we're also not going to say that Black people need to be the only ones doing the work or filling the boxes, and that our brain spaces exist to promote diversity in all fields. That's something that I'm always happy to see. But yeah, the fact that this has staying power and I haven't seen it go away, you know, I'm in a bit of a echo chamber online on social media, but I still see it a conversation in a lot of spaces that it might have gone away. And so that gives me hope, is that everyone's going to be beholden to a new standard.
Yeah, thank you so much, Debbie. And
Yeah.
we just have a few minutes left. And before I do a closing of appreciation and everybody sings happy birthday to Eriqah, I won't torture the community like that. I did just want to get to at least one of the questions here, and maybe Debbie, I can start with you. Do you have any recommendations for how sustainability staff can sort of best foster relationships with DEI communities on their campus right now, particularly amidst everybody is incredibly overwhelmed in trying to sort of put out these responses? Any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I have to do, because I'm not a diversity professional. I am a Black person that is happily in the sustainability space. So I think like I have to make sure to point people to resources that are out there. I know AASHE has a really great resource that's titled after the same discussion series. The RESJ has a lot of tools. But one thing I can say from the sustainability side, and I've had the opportunity to go speak with the diversity vice president at an institution I worked with. And that relationship did not start with, hey, I can help you with your work or anything. That conversation was actually, hey, I think your boss is trying to do my job. Like, what's going on? And so, you know, that gave me a lot of insight. And I think that that's advice I can pass on, is that not everyone is going to recognize that sustainability is framed broadly and that it includes diversity and inclusion. So when you go into a conversation with that, you need to recognize that they might think that you're overstepping because they wouldn't understand exactly the correlation. So start with discussing like, hey, here's how the field actually exists, and this is why I want to have the conversation with you, and that my only goal is to support really important work and make sure that sustainability resources get framed towards social equity and not just, you know, the green stuff that is traditionally thought of in many institutions.
Debbie, thank you so much for those comments. And I just want to see if Eric or Kimberly has anything you want to add, knowing that we're basically at time.
Well, I mean, so that Eriqah doesn't have to do it, I oversee the U.S. market for the Green Building Council. So I think in terms of regions, so we can send you the list. I always push people to Partnership for Southern Equity when you're in the South. AASHE Inc. Dr. Tia Martin was the former Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Boston, the first of the 100 resilient officers to focus race as a core indicator for the work in building resilient communities. So that organization, AASHE Inc., those two, I think have really good systems and structures grounded in ESG, but also focused on equity and race. So that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Kimberly. Eriqah, any thoughts?
I just wanted to follow up. These ladies definitely said it clearer than I could, but I wanted to follow up on something Debbie said. Not every person of color or Black person is slated to, wants to, cares to educate folks on how to not be racist. It is exhausting. It is sometimes demoralizing. It can also be disempowering. And not every person of color, not every person has some melanin in their skin is a diversity professional. And so with that being said, pay your diversity professionals, pay the folks that are geared towards doing that work and trained to do that work. And if you have some questions on who can do that work, I got a bunch of names in my Rolodex. Use an older word, Rolodex. So yeah, I just wanted to say that real quick.
That's a super important point, Erica. And as we wrap up here, I'll say that AASHE has been engaged with 2 Black women since March this year, consultants that are helping us to center racial equity and social justice in everything that we do. So engaging those experts as opposed to tapping a Black person or other person of color that you might know and ask them, how do I not be racist? Definitely a better approach. And I really want to celebrate and thank and appreciate Erica, Debbie, and Kimberly for your time today, for your sharing of all of your experiences, and frankly, for all of the work that you have done and are doing. And Kimberly Lewis, you said this, to prioritize self-care because the world needs you. And I'm so grateful to y'all for spending this time with AASHE. A reminder to everybody who's still on the call that the conversation continues next week. We're having another discussion, and then there's going to be a recap webinar. So we have 2 more opportunities to engage. And again, this is just the beginning. There's been lots of questions here around structural changes. We want to support, AASHE wants to support our community as much as possible to center racial equity and social justice. So stay tuned, more, and appreciation. This is like virtual with sign language for appreciation to Kimberly, Debbie, and Erica, as well as Nakia and AASHE Kimberly for all your help today. So thank you all. Happy birthday, Erica. Bye, all.
Happy birthday, Erica.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Megan. Thanks,
Happy
Kimberly.
birthday, Erica.
Bye.
Nice to meet you guys. Thank you so much. Great conversation.
Thank you. Kimberly.